Hi, everyone. Today, what we're going to be doing is looking at our second subtopic with reference to social psychology, looking at leisure. So, if we go back to the first part of our course framework, we looked at culture and leisure. We talk about how a lot of countries today are really trying to emphasize leisure because they recognize how leisure can produce happiness in its society members. So there's this focus on, leisure and happiness on a policy kind of institutional level, but now we'll kind of bring down leisure and happiness more to the social psychological level. So, if you want to get down to it, what is it about leisure that does produce happiness? And, why do certain leisure forms produce more happiness than other leisure forms? So basically, what is this relationship between happiness and leisure? And so the first article we looked at with respect to leisure got into this a little bit. And I intentionally kind of ignored that conversation because I knew it would be focusing on those ideas more today. So basically, Newman, they were looking at different studies at how leisure is conceptualized, how it's defined, and basically it's all over the place. So it's really difficult to generalize different researches, different studies, when people are using different concepts. In other words, if you conceptualize leisure as these things, but somebody else conceptualizes leisure as other things, then you really can't compare those studies because you're looking at two different concepts of leisure. So what the authors are trying to do here is basically come up with an understanding of what does produce more positive leisure experiences. And then they're trying to create what we call an operational definition of leisure. So a leisure a definition that can be used in the future by other researchers. And when you're using the same operational definition, and then you can begin to compare studies down the line. So first, we can look at how leisure is made up of both what we call structural and subjective elements. And so the structural element has to do with kind of time, uh, how much you're doing it, how little you're doing it, how often you're doing it. So think of the structural element of leisure as basically the quantity element, how much time you're doing it, how often you're doing it. The subjective dimension of leisure is basically, your personal understandings, your personal judgments of the leisure activities. So personally, do you enjoy what you're doing? Or personally, are you not enjoying yourself that much? And so, we'll get into this a little bit later, but for my wife and I, there's some leisure activities we enjoy doing, and other leisure activities that one of us enjoys more than the other. So, for example, one of my favorite things to do is go to the horse races, and that to me, subjectively, is fun. Something I really enjoy doing. But for my wife, on the other hand, she'd rather be doing something else. She doesn't evaluate that leisure experience as being as meaningful for her compared to me. So that's what we're looking at, kind of the personal understanding of leisure, the subjective element versus the structural element of kind of how long and how often you're actually doing it. And so here, basically, we're going to be breaking down the five main connections in terms of, what are those important aspects of leisure and that contributes to positive leisure experiences, or perhaps that contribute to a leisure experience not bringing that much happiness. So basically, we'll go down, these five different attributes, bam, 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 and kind of recognize the correlation to happiness with each. So first, they talked about detachment recovery. Basically, this is how detached you are from your work as you're doing your leisure. And the connection is the further you are away from work, the more positive the leisure experience typically is for somebody. So, we can say that, going out after work with a group of your friends versus going out for a drink after work with your coworkers, the friend activity should carry more happiness because you're getting yourself away from work. While, if you go out after work with your coworkers, yeah, you're out of the office, but still you're around your work because you're around your coworkers. And so basically, what we find is the further you get away from your work as you're doing your leisure, the more positive leisure experience that people get. And so the second element we can look at here is autonomy. So with this attribute, autonomy basically is, how much control do you have in terms of doing what you want to do and how you want to do it. So if you choose your leisure activity, that should bring more happiness compared to if somebody is choosing it for you. And so basically, that's the correlation you find here. The more in control of kind of the leisure you are in terms of what you're doing, when you're doing it, how you're doing it, the more happiness it's going to bring. But when you have less autonomy, kind of less freedom to choose kind of what, when, and how, that kind of less autonomy carries a less positive leisure experience with it. So now we can get into a third one. So again, kind of keep in mind, we're looking at different attributes, the detachment recovery and how that relates to leisure happiness, the autonomy and how that relates to leisure happiness. And now we can look at mastery. So here's another idea of control, but not control of kind of choice, doing what you want to do when you want to do it, but control in the sense that you're kind of good at what you're doing. So, you're doing something that, you're very good at, you can comprehend well in comparison to something that you're clueless, you're not doing very well at it at all. So, you could compare this to like playing a video game or a board game. If you know how to play the video game or the board game and you're kind of doing it well, you feel like you're in control. You're controlling the situation. Compared to if you're playing the video game or the board game for the first time, you feel like the game is in control of you. You don't know what you're doing. You're trying to learn as you go, and the game's controlling you more than you're controlling the game. And with that situation, when you feel like things are out of control because you don't know what you're doing, those leisure experiences will bring less happiness compared to the leisure experiences where you feel like you're in control, when you feel like you're doing something with efficacy. So we'll get into meaning, and this kind of touches into that subjective conversation I just had. When the leisure activity has special meaning to you, and then it should carry more happiness when you do it. And compared to something that lacks that special meaning, those activities shouldn't bring as much happiness as a result. So again, I'll just go back to horse racing as an example. I grew up going to the horse races with my family. All of us would go together. Sometimes I just go with my dad. Other times it's my sister and I. So nevertheless, it's been like a family activity since I was a little kid. And so with that experience, it really has special meaning for me because I kind of, think back to when I was a kid, when I was, high school and college, now as an adult, and how these experiences carry a lot of meaning because of where they started and with whom I kind of do the leisure. Compared again to my wife, she never went to the races before until we met. And so, really doesn't have that special significance to her because she really didn't have that early socialization that made it significant for her. So again, it makes sense. If you have a personal connection to an activity, it should bring more happiness compared to if you lack a connection to that activity. And so lastly, we get into affiliation. So here, basically, the question is, are you doing the leisure activity by yourself, as an individual, or are you doing it socially with other people? And so like all these, it's not black and white, there is room for, difference, but these are the patterns the research finds. So the pattern here basically says that we typically get more out of our leisure experiences when we do it with other people. So if I go to the horse races with my family, with my friends, I'll get more out of it compared to if I go to the horse races by myself. And so again, maybe sometimes that's true, but other times maybe I prefer to be by myself. So again, this one has a little bit more grayish area compared to the previous four. But nevertheless, again, this is what the research finds. And we can acknowledge that maybe some people are more introverted and they prefer to do leisure by themselves. Yes, we can acknowledge that. But for the most part, when you study people, people get more out of these social activities than the activities being done individually. So, overall, that's what you find. And we'll go back to these structural and symbolic elements. And so, of the two, which matters more? Does it matter kind of how often you're doing it, or how little you're doing it, how long you're doing it, or how short you're doing it? Does that outweigh the subjective dimension of your personal evaluation? Or does the subjective dimension, your personal evaluation of the leisure activity, outweigh the structural elements when it comes to happiness? So, although both come together, both are important, what you find is the subjective element is more important in terms of, if you're doing a lot of something that you really don't enjoy doing, then you're not going to get a lot out of it. Compared to, if you're doing something not that often, but kind of every now and again, but you really enjoy doing it, then that's going to bring you the happiness. So again, both come together, the quantity of time and the quality in terms of a personal evaluation. But if you had to say one outweighs the other, it's the subjective element of the personal evaluation outweighs the structural elements of time when it comes to which is more influential when it comes to connecting leisure to higher levels of happiness. So, I want to leave that there for today. Just kind of breaking it down social psychologically, leisure and its connection to happiness. So I'll leave that there for today. And in our next class, we'll get back into our book reports, get into our second book of the semester. And with that, we'll be looking at kind of issues of work, issues of play. So it kind of ties into leisure as a subtopic, but specifically we'll be looking at social psychology and the social construction of reality in Gary Allen Fine's book, Kitchens.